of the presentation. I'm going to be covering a little bit on how to perform an inspection, and then talk a little bit about erosion and sediment controls, and then move into some interactive part of this where we're going to talk about some pictures that we have and get into some discussion about what's wrong and what can be fixed and how we can fix it. So real quickly to start out, just the top 4 problems found during EPA inspections, and this is, looking at national data, so it's not real detailed, but you can see here that they had SWIPs not updated, which I think is pretty common. Poor housekeeping on the site, again, another pretty common thing. Missing and incomplete inspection reports, I think that that's kind of a corollary to the, the SWIP not updated. That's probably the thing that I see most, is that people don't have inspection forms and things kept in the SWIPs what they're supposed to be on site and available to the inspector. And then BMP's not maintained, which is kind of no surprise either. On kind of a broad overview, the purpose of inspections, why you're really out there, it's certainly to prevent pollution into the receiving waters, of course, but to identify and correct BMP failures first and foremost, and then also to identify and correct potential failures, because we're also looking for, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute, potential pollution sources. If it's not raining, you don't really have a lot of potential for pollution other than non-stormwater and trash blowing off the site. So you are, one of your main charges is to look for things that may break or may fail during a rain event. And of course, overall then to ensure compliance with your municipal codes, and on a public works type project where you have general permit coverage, as we talked about in the first session, to also enforce the construction general permit. So what do we want to inspect when we're out there? Well, certainly areas that have not achieved final stabilization, that are still under active coverage of the permit. And the permit defines final stabilization as 70% of the vegetation coverage that was there pre-project. So that's something that you have to understand. What was the vegetation coverage before you started work, and you have to at least have 70% of that before you can file a notice of termination or a change of information to exclude that portion of the project from permit coverage. And of course, be all done with construction. We're going to be looking most importantly though at erosion and sediment control BMPs, because as Dan said, that's, yeah, go ahead. Well, it's going to be different for every site. If you're in an urban area and you're doing redevelopment, it might be pretty close to 100%, because you may have had, buildings, parking lots, and landscaping already. If it's a vacant lot, yeah, that's, again, it's going to be site specific. You have to look at it, make your own judgment, but I'm going to say it's usually in this area between 50 and 70%. Yes, you want to, and the best thing to do is obviously take digital photos, that you can have, so that everybody can weigh in at the end of the project, right? So we want to inspect those areas that aren't finally stabilized. We're looking at the erosion and sediment control BMPs specifically, and we're looking for the evidence of the potential for soil and other pollutants to leave the construction site. And some of the potential pollutants that you're going to see out there, as Dan talked about in the first module, cement residue. That's a big one. If it's lying on the ground, when runoff runs across that, you're going to change the pH of the runoff water. So that's something that needs to be cleaned up. Oil stains, same thing. Water runs across it, it's going to pick up the petroleum hydrocarbons. So that's a violation of the general permit. It's a violation really of your MS4 permit to leave that kind of thing on the ground. Certainly the permit has no tolerance for trash leaving the site. Trash bins have to be covered at the end of the day and before rain events. If trash blows off the site, it is a violation of the general permit, and most likely a violation of the MEP standard in your MS4 permit. Porta potties, when they get serviced, they get hosed out. You don't want that. That's a non-stormwater. You don't want that finding its way into the street gutter, which is part of the MS4 system, and then into the storm drain system. And then just all non-stormwater in general. The permit talks about some types of non-stormwater that are allowed, but in general, any non-stormwater that's generated on the construction site has to remain on the construction site and cannot be discharged off, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. So that's what to inspect, how to inspect. Start your inspections at the downstream end of the site, moving upstream. And the reason you're doing that is you're looking for any signs of pollution that have left the site previously, discoloration, sediment, oil and grease stains, anything like that. You're looking for those discharges that potentially have left the site so that you can find those sources as you're moving through the site and look to see if the BMP has failed, or more often than not, there simply is not a BMP that is allowing that release of pollutants. So keeping that in mind as you move. Hopefully everybody's got a camera, a digital camera, because again, that's pictures worth 1,000 words, and documenting your inspection using that is invaluable. When you're looking at the BMPs, same thing, look downstream of the BMP to see how it's performing, and then upstream and review the BMP. And again, always looking for potential or actual pollution that's left the site. Some of the key locations that you want to inspect while you're out there, certainly all the disturbed areas. Is there erosion control on areas that have been inactive for more than 14 days? Is there erosion control on the areas prior to rain events, particularly critical on Risk 2 sites? The site perimeter has to have basic sediment controls around the entire perimeter. The conveyances you're looking at on site to make sure that they're not contributing to erosion or eroding themselves, or being filled with sedimentation. A lot of times you'll see that on concrete V-ditches where they're just chock full of sediment. So that needs to be cleaned out, and you need to find the source of that sediment. What's the BMP that's failed? If you have a receiving water on your site, if your site abuts a receiving water, the thing that we're trying to protect with this entire program, it's good to look at that receiving water edge and see if any sediment, trash, or anything is making its way into the channel or the stream. All drain inlets have to be protected, so you're looking to make sure that they are and that nothing's making its way through those. And then the storm drain outfalls and other discharge points too. What's coming off the site? Again, that's where you're going to start your inspection, at those outfall points, to make sure that it looks like the BMPs are performing adequately on site. Some of the key items at that locations to inspect, certainly stockpiles. Stockpiles are a major potential source of turbidity. It's loose, unconsolidated soil at a very steep angle, and so when rain hits that, it's going to immediately start eroding. You're going to get turbidity in the water with the fine particles, and that's going to find its way off site. Solid waste storage. Driven it home a couple times now. The waste containers need to be used. They need to be covered at the end of the day. The reason the permit requires covering waste containers at the end of the day is if you get wind at night, you don't want trash just blowing out uncontrolled while nobody's there. Sanitary facilities need to have secondary containment, move back away from the street, so if they are tipped over or when they're washed out, the water isn't going down into the storm drain system. All the hazardous materials need to be put into cargo containers, covered somehow from rain so that it's not coming in contact with rainwater. Same thing with the equipment service and fueling areas. Waste and borrow sites tend to be a kind of a stepchild. They don't get quite as much attention on BMPs, but they're every bit as critical as the active construction area. And then we've talked a lot about concrete washout areas. They need to be watertight. So let's talk about the erosion and sediment control BMPs a little bit, what's out there, the tools that are available and how they work. And then we're going to go into kind of the interactive, looking at some pictures and discussing those. So soil binders are a very good very temporary, I would say, erosion control tool. If you spray on a soil binder, it's going to last 1, maybe 2 storm events. So they're very good for areas of the site that are actively being worked. And on a Risk 2 site, you need to have a soil binder down on all areas that are active of the construction site prior to a rain event, or you will not be meeting the numeric action level for turbidity. It's just not going to happen. And I have a little chart here in a few more slides, but some examples of a soil binder are polyacrylamide, known as PAM, guar, starch, and there's plenty of proprietary products out there as well. Next step up, and a little more money, a little more longevity. Generally, when you pay more money You get a little more service life out of the BMP. And for spray-on products, that would be a hydraulic mulch. That's a wood fiber that's mixed in with the binders that we just talked about before, the spray-on binders. So those two are combined, goes down, about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch thick, and then provides a soil cover and kind of a crust. And these will last generally 2 or 3 storm events. If it's a light year, maybe even up to an entire season. A little more expensive. They need about 24 hours to dry after you apply them. Landscape mulch is also a good alternative. If you're at a small home site and they brought the slopes and everything up to finished grade, applying a couple inches of landscape mulch over there is going to go a long way to, again, keeping soil erosion from occurring. Yes.
Hey, with the demise of redevelopment, our city is going through and demoing all the properties that we own,
Mm-hmm.
and they're allowed to do that with the remaining money that's still sitting out there. Since we're probably looking at a long-term vacant property, and so the ones over an acre are going to have to be general plan compliant or general permit compliant, what would be the best stabilization to do on that, thinking it's going to be there a couple of seasons?
So yeah, the question is, what's the best kind of long-term stabilization for a couple of seasons? There's a couple options. I guess my top recommendation would be to hydroseed it. Now, that's going to require that something actually grows. So unless you can strategically hydroseed it, like I would probably looking to do that mid to the end of October. Then you can take advantage of the rain, get some germination. Hydroseed's the best because you're going to have, you're not going to have to babysit it. You get some growth. Even if it dies, you still have a stabilized site then. If you can water it or have a contractor water it from a water truck and ensure growth, that would be the way to go. Landscape mulch would be an option, just like you see here, blowing this on. That would probably be around for a couple years if you put it on a couple inches thick. A bonded fiber matrix would also, and that's a slide that's coming up, would definitely do the job. It's going to be around for 4 to 5 years. It'll allow volunteer vegetation, even without seeding, to come through, just because it retains a little moisture and provides some protection. So after 2 or 3 years, you'll get a pretty good coverage. None of those are cheap. They just aren't. That's the bad news. The good news is there are tools that you can use, but the bad news is they're not going to be cheap. Blowing on the hydroseed and timing it well with the rains is probably the cheapest approach. Landscape mulch is probably second cheapest. Bonded fiber matrix probably third. And that's.
So the other, I guess the initial response I had to them was I don't remember the names of it, but the kind of the polymer spray that
Mm-hmm.
that solidifies the rocks and prevents it from breaking down. That's simply a short term.
Yeah, and that's what I just talked about, the spray-on binders. Those aren't going to last very long. They break down under UV. The one we just looked at here, hydraulic mulch, that's going to last you maybe 6 months. So that's another way to go. If you wanted to shoot down some hydroseed, then put down a layer of hydraulic mulch over the top of the hydroseed. That could potentially be functional, because what that'll do is it'll, number one, it gives you 2 shots of water. The hydroseed goes down with water, and then the hydraulic mulch goes down with a second shot of water. So you get 2 shots of water to try to get some things growing, and then, waiting for the rain. But it's still dicey around here unless you irrigate and really get some good coverage if you don't hit the rain right. And, it doesn't, if you're demoing in May, it's not going to help you, right? So, yeah, those are pretty much your options that you have for long-term stabilization, yeah. No, the question is that always a 2-step process? No, it's something you have to specify. Some people put binder right in with the hydroseed mix, and put a little fiber in there, just do it all at once. I think it's better as a 2-step process because, again, you get that 2 shots of water, and all seeds need water to grow. And you get, a little more material. You get this hydroseed down there, and then you get this protective layer over the top of it. So it's a better process, a better mix, and it's also about twice as expensive. So again, if you're going to, the more performance you're going to get out of these things, the more you're going to have to pay for them. And so bonded fiber matrix is pretty, in terms of spray-ons, it's top of the line. It goes on very thick, about a 1/4 inch usually. It's again a glue with a binder type thing, similar to a hydraulic mulch, but just goes on a lot thicker and has a lot more longevity. And does an excellent job really in areas where you don't have concentrated flow. If you have like a flat pad, or as you can see here, a slope where you've got the proper sediment controls in terms of straw wattles or compost wattles there, it's going to perform very, very well. So what's the downside? The downside is it's very, very expensive. You know, it goes on at about $5,500 an acre, roughly. So that adds up very quickly. But you're going to get, like I say, multiple years of performance out of this type of a product. Another product which performs just as well is straw mulch. Again, performance just as good as bonded fiber matrix. It's cheaper. It's less than half the price. So what's the problem with it? The longevity. You guys have probably all seen straw mulch. And you're lucky if it's there a season. It's really looking for 4 to 6 months maybe you can get out of straw mulch, and then it's just kind of gone. It has to be applied at the proper rate. So on 2-to-1 slopes, you're looking at 4 tons per acre. Anything less than that, you can drop down to 3 tons or 2 tons per acre, and it has to be crimped in, otherwise it's all just going to blow away. It's also a little bit of a fire hazard. Another option is geotextiles and mats, and these are, you know, again, very pricey, probably twice what you're going to pay for bonded fiber matrix on a per acre basis. So it would be good in kind of smaller areas where you're not going to hydroseed, you don't have room to do anything else, but you need coverage. So you'll see Caltrans will do this around bridge abutments and things like that, where they just, you know, they don't have much of a landscape budget, but they need to get coverage and they need to terminate and get out of there, and they can't, you know, babysit any erosion control products. So not a bad way to go, but again, since they're, you know, you're up around $10,000 an acre for putting down mats, they're probably limited to, you know, smaller areas. And then finally, as we've already kind of talked about, hydroseed is your end game. It should be. You know, anytime you can get something to grow on your site, that's going to give you the best protection, and you're not going to be having to be out there maintaining it. Once you get good germination, even if it dies, you still have that root structure. You still have the dead plant there, which, you know, breaks up the raindrop impact and keeps you from getting the erosion. So if you can hydroseed, that is the way to go, absolutely. But again, you've got to get something. You can't, hydroseed in and of itself is not an erosion control. It's water, fertilizer, and seeds sprayed out of a hose. That's what hydroseed is. And unless the stuff germinates, you're not getting what you need to get to the goal line. So here's a summary chart like I talked about. So the stabilizers, think of this as just the spray-on glues. You can put this out of a water truck, or it can come out of a hydroseed truck, but it's really just water and then the material, the glue. And it works by just gluing the soil particles together, and it's not going to be very effective for more than 1 or 2 storms because it just gets beat up. UV decomposes it, and it's not going to be around long. But what's the saving grace of it? It's cheap. You know, you're looking at $400 to $500 an acre. It can go on quickly. It doesn't really need to dry before it starts getting rained on. And you can see you have, you know, several options there available to you. A lot of proprietary products out there, and you guys can see what works eventually in your area for your soils the best. The next step up again is the mulches. You can blow straw mulch, it needs to be crimped in, the wood fiber mulch, cellulose that we talked about, and then the bonded fiber matrix. All work okay. You're going to pay for, again, the longevity in general. And then the rolled erosion control products, or the blankets. I recommend that you talk to somebody who sells these things, just like the spray-ons too, to find out, again, what's working in your area and what the best performance is for your needs. How long do I want it to be there? You know, that's really the basic independent variable to help you with your decision. You can see there the core of the coconut mat is the most expensive, and the reason is that stuff just lasts forever. I've seen coconut mats out in the field, been there 5 years, they still look very, very good. So that's something that has a lot of longevity, yeah.
These estimated costs, does that include installation?
Yes. Yeah, these costs all include installation. So you can see that, you know, again, roughly twice what a spray-on product is, but you get absolute coverage from day one, and a lot of these mats will persist many, many years. So it's an option for you in, again, probably the smaller areas. We're going to shift gears just real quickly now and talk about sediment controls. The permit requires an effective combination of erosion and sediment control, so you have to have both. Typically, what I see on construction sites is erosion control kind of goes out the window, is forgone in favor of the sediment controls. And that's unfortunate because the erosion control is going to get you really 80% of the way there. It's the true prevention, and it really is specifically targeted at turbidity prevention, which is what we're being measured against, or what we're physically measuring down at the end of the pipe. So not having the erosion control sites puts you at an extreme deficit. You know, none of these things that you see here are going to reduce measurably the turbidity in your runoff, and that's because we have clay soils in this area. These things are pretty good for sand-sized particles, but not the clay-sized particles that create the turbidity that you're measuring with your meter at the storm drain outfalls. So you need to use erosion controls to do that. But again, the permit requires erosion and sediment controls. Yes? That's a good question. None of these things are, you know, absolute. They're just kind of guidelines. Certainly on a rock entrance, the proof's going to be in the pudding. If you have a clean street, it's working. If you don't, it's not. I'd say that's probably, yeah, a little bit too conservative. It's all going to be really about, at the end of the day, how much truck traffic you got coming in and out. Yeah, you're right, I should change that. You're right, again, it's going to be, do you have a clean street? And I think around here in the winter with the clay soils that we have, you're going to be looking at a wheel wash anyway in most locations. Silt fence, you know, when you're inspecting a silt fence, your basic job is going to make sure that they're not being abused, and there's just a lot of silt fence abuse out there. I know you've all seen it. Make sure that the post is on the downstream side so that the water's pressing the fabric into the post instead of the other way around. Make sure that they're put along a contour and that they are used for sheet flow condition. They're not a concentrated flow device. They're not to be put down the fall line or perpendicular to the contours creating a preferential flow path. So the silt fence works pretty good as long as it's not installed incorrectly or carelessly. But it's not going to remove the turbidity in general from the runoff, which is what you're measuring. It's going to remove the larger particles, the sand-sized particles, and bigger usually. Sediment basin is a concentrated flow device. As Dan mentioned, this has to be designed per fact sheet SE2. That's available on the CASCA website, no charge. It's available on the State Board website, no charge. The sediment basins have to be designed by a civil engineer. And as you can see here, they also need to have an emergency spillway. And this basin didn't have one. It ended up failing over there. Here's a little schematic, you can see that. So it has an engineered outlet riser and then an emergency spillway and energy dissipation. Those are kind of the main elements that you should be looking for in a sediment basin. Fiber rolls are a good perimeter control. They're also good to segment slopes, but they have to be installed correctly too. You need that contact between the fiber roll and the soil. If you go out and look at your fiber rolls and you can see light underneath them, they're not going to do any good because the water's just going to blow underneath them. They're a sheet flow device as well. Sheet flow hits them and stops and then has to reaccelerate, and that's what keeps you from getting rilling on the slopes. If the water's blowing right under the fiber roll, it's not going to do anybody any good. And the permit has specific spacing that it requires for fiber rolls on slopes. Gravel bag berms, these are good for kind of the check dam type thing. They're good on perimeter controls. Anytime you're really going to be ponding water a little bit higher up. You see these a lot on undercut street sections to keep the rilling from occurring in between them. So you have, like you see in the picture here, a couple of rows of those every once in a while. How often do you know how to space them? Well, if you're getting rilling in between them, you need another row in between those two. But a pretty good BMP. The problem with them is, as you all know, people run over them and the sun hits them and they tend to just split their guts, so they're kind of high maintenance, and that's something that you have to insist on occurring, because obviously a bag that split its guts is no longer performing its function, and then the bag ends up in the storm drain system, and that just becomes trash. Inlet protection required. Couple of basic things though. Gravel bags are really still the best way to do virtually all types of inlet protection. The principle is to stop the water, have it pond, the particles settle out, and then the clearer water bleeds through the bags. You really don't want filter fabric in general during rain events, because it's not going to pass enough water, and it's just going to get pushed into the inlet, or it's going to clog the inlet, and you're not going to get any water into it. So good idea during the dry weather times to keep dirt out of the storm drain. In wet weather, should not use the filter fabric type inlet protection. Temporary construction entrance, again, we'd already just had this discussion. Really, if it's working, if you have a clean street, then the entrance that you have is good. But generally, rock and rumble plates during the winter, when you get the clay soils and it's sticking to the tires, isn't going to keep the street clean enough, and you're going to have some sort of a wheel wash. Whether that's a guy standing there with a hose or one of these fancy ones like you see here that are automatic and recycle the water, doesn't matter. Main point is that you want it done, and you don't want that wheel wash water leaving your site, because that's a non-stormwater discharge. So just make sure it's contained on site, that it's soaking in a pit on site and not leaving the site. Dewatering, very simple rule that I have for you. If you are pumping water on a construction site, you probably need a permit. And that's a permit beyond what is in the construction general permit, certainly for groundwater. If you can let water gravity drain off site, and I'm talking about groundwater now, groundwater only, any water that's generated on site by the contractor, equipment washing, wheel wash, stuff like that, this doesn't apply to. That needs to be retained on site. But groundwater, if you can gravity drain it off site, you're probably fine. You don't need a permit, because that's what's considered naturally occurring. But if the minute you start pumping it, you need to check with the regional board if there has to be a permit. And as an inspector, that's all you need to do. If you're pumping water, do you have a permit? Can you show me that you don't need a permit? I want to see something from the Regional Water Quality Control Board, yes or no. And I would insist on having that. At the very minimum, I would check with your city's NPDS coordinator to make sure that that area isn't in an area that has contaminated groundwater. Most, unfortunately, of the areas within Orange County do have contaminated groundwater. So pumping groundwater off of a construction site is not going to be allowed without a permit. Keep all your materials from coming in contact with stormwater. We talked about concrete waste. It's the cement we're worried about. It's not the big chunks of concrete which are inert, but the cement, the fine cement that's going to change the pH of runoff water. So that's why these have to be watertight now. They can't leak, because if they leak out onto the ground, that's the water. Then you've got runoff that runs across that, and you're going to get high pH runoff. All right, so that's kind of just the, yeah.
Question about the concrete washout.
Uh-huh.
Would concrete cutting into like pavers, would that be considered the same thing, or is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have a concrete saw going, the cooling water from the saw, and then that dust also from cutting the pavers, same thing, that's going to be dissolved essentially in water, and that's going to change the pH. So I've got some pictures here, and I just like, it's very informal. You guys can just tell me what you see is wrong, and some of them will actually have things that are right. And we can just kind of talk about those and go through these here real quickly. So obviously, there's a big problem here. Somebody yesterday, I said, what's the problem with this? They said, well, it rained. Yeah, I agree with that. But, there's kind of three things that I would, put in my inspection report if I saw this type of a slope. So what do you think? Anybody? Yeah, there's no erosion control, so that would be number one. There's no sediment control, right? There was no straw wattles. So those are the first two things that go in the corrective action. The third one is really, you're not going to get this type of gullying on a slope unless you have a lot of water coming over the top of that slope uncontrolled, correct? So that's, you see that a lot on construction sites. So that would be the third thing in my inspection report of this, is some sort of a berm along the top of that slope to direct that water that's obviously coming right over the top over to a conveyance, a down drain, or some sort of terrace or V-ditch or something like that, or into a sediment basin, something that is meant to handle concentrated flow, because slopes are not designed to handle concentrated flow. What do you think here then? I've got a trash problem, number one, correct? I mean, that would be one of the things. There's not good housekeeping. What else, though? I mean, what's the main issue with this one? Yeah, there's no erosion control, and there's this, there's a problem here with the equipment driving in and out, correct? I mean, we've got a lot of rock, and it's really been thrown there, in my opinion, to protect the curb so they don't nick it up. But it's also kind of acting as a construction entrance, so as I'm driving off, I'm knocking all the dust off into that rock, and the rock is sitting in the gutter of the street. So I'm really concentrating dirt into the gutter where you're going to get flow. So if you see things like that, that rock should all be moved on site. Probably it's a very tight site. You're going to need to just have them rock the whole area where the vehicles are delivering materials, most likely around that location, and then keep that rock out of the gutter. They could pile some lumber there or something to keep the curb from getting nicked up. But that's the wrong approach. It's going to be, again, kind of a reverse BMP in essence, right? It's causing more of a problem at that location than they think they may be helping. So erosion control on the site, because it's obviously at finished grade, got somewhat of a trash problem, and then the entrance is a big deal. Here, this is, obviously a softball for you, right? You have to have inlet protection, correct? So this would be an immediate notice site. But the other thing that I would look at here is, did any of the dirt, and it most likely did, make it into the storm drain system? And make them clean that out too. There's no way that the city should be accepting for maintenance a storm drain system that comes preloaded with a bunch of dirt, because that's going to then just be flushed right out with the first rain into the receiving water. And, the person that runs the city's municipal sampling program is going to be out there sampling, and they're going to have to explain this big slug of turbidity, and trace it back upstream. So it may not seem like it, but the things that you can do on construction sites are actually going to pay dividends later on in avoided work for other people. It's kind of like the fire safety. How many lives do fire department inspections saves? Nobody really knows, but they do save a lot, so we do them. And it's really the same thing here. It's going to save a lot of work on the back end of sampling, writing reports, doing corrective actions, trying to figure out where some of this stuff is coming from. All right, so what do you think about this picture? What are, good things and bad things I'm looking for? Yeah, the trash is the thing that draws my eye right away. It's the dumpster's uncovered, it's overflowing. You got a nice little pile there next to it. So that's one of the main things here. Obviously, we have the same problem with the rock in the street, right? It's got the same issue going there. A couple of the good things, though, I see here are we've got cargo containers, and it looks like they're using them and storing their materials and stuff in there, so that's a thumbs up. And then the porta potty placement, is okay in my book. It's back off the street, so if it gets serviced, the non-storm water is not going to make its way out into the gutter. So I like that too. The street looks like you got a little bit of problem there. You got some dirt in the street that needs to be cleaned up, so that might be some stuff that gets noted, picked up with, the corrective action going with the rock. I think so. It's more a performance-based thing. you've seen those guys when they service them, they hose out the floor, and you just want to make sure that that water's not going to make it into any conveyance, that it's going to stay on site. Yeah, there's not enough space. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So your objective is to make sure that the non-stormwater, and if they get tipped over, any of the blue non-stormwater isn't going to make it into the MS4, which includes the curb and gutter. So here, it's a little, well, I guess it comes out okay on that screen. What do you think of this construction entrance? Pardon? Yeah, it's got rock. There's no rumble plate. And I think what you're saying, and I agree, it's questionable about the length of this one. The other thing that you can see right here is that it's starting to touch home, right, in terms of maintenance. It's starting to get filled up with sediment. And so these things don't last forever. You need to add some more rock or, hog this out and put down new rock. But it's not going to last indefinitely, so they need to be serviced. Again, I wouldn't get too excited about this because the proof is in the performance. If the street adjacent to this is clean, then, it's not a battle worth fighting at all. But if the street's dirty, I think you know the problem. Here? Yeah, the oil stain. This is potential pollution. It's got to be cleaned up, so I'd be, writing this up. I'd be back a few days later to make sure it was done. The runoff runs across that. It's probably diesel fuel from this auxiliary power unit. It's going to pick up the hydrocarbons and be into the storm drain system, and then, again, somebody's going to be measuring that downstream somewhere and having to write up why it's there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question is, is non-petroleum based hydraulic oil okay? And the answer still would be no. I mean, that's going to have what they call a biochemical oxygen demand, a BOD. And so if there's enough of that that finds its way into the stream or the receiving water, that's still going to then create this oxygen deficit. It's still pollution, and it's better. I'm going to give it to you. It's much better, and I feel a lot better that they're using that over petroleum-based, but it's still not okay. I don't think so. If it's all truly vegetable-based, I don't think it would. Right. What's wrong with this picture? Yeah, we got an uncovered stockpile, and the placement was strategic, correct? It's in the gutter. Are you going to let stockpiles remain in the gutter on your sites? No. I mean, if we get any kind of rain, or if the guy upstream is even washing his car, you're going to get water stacking up against that. It's going to pick up the dirt, it's going to be turbid, and it's going to go into the storm drain system. So two things here, it's an uncovered stockpile, but the placement is just absolutely wrong. And then storage of construction materials too, this isn't a big deal, the rebar here, but the general permit talks about covering construction materials. Construction materials are fine when they're in their final constructed form. But if I have a roll of chain link fence, say, laying on the ground, it should have a tarp over it. And that's because it's kind of a concentrated source of zinc. If it's up in a chain link fence, it's going to be distributed all around the site. You're still going to get some zinc coming off of that, but it's going to have a lot better chance of soaking into the ground before it, runs off into the storm drain system. Now rebar, you're going to get, kind of a high iron reading. That's no big deal. Iron takes a lot of iron to be a problem in the environment, but it's still, strictly speaking, a violation of the permit, and these materials should be covered prior to rain events. Is this acceptable as a concrete washout? No, it's not watertight, correct? So this is going to do nothing for our primary objective, which is to control the pH of water that hits the cement. The water's going to hit that, it's going to flow out past the straw wattle. Straw wattle is going to do nothing to control pH, and we're going to be down at the end of that site with our little meter seeing 10 and wondering why we have 10. Well, this is why. Here, the problem is, yeah, we got dirt in the street. The reason being, I don't know about you, but I don't see any sort of really a construction entrance there. So two things I'd be citing on this: to clean the street and to install a proper construction entrance. How about here? Yeah, there's no perimeter control. Correct. So got to get a perimeter control installed, got to clean the sidewalk. For the sharp-eyed among you, there's another problem here. You know, that's an inlet, so it's unprotected. If you want to get really picky and you're having a bad day, there's trash in the gutter. So, a couple things for sure. 3 things I'd have on my report: clean the sidewalk, install a perimeter control, and protect the inlet. Here, how would you, obviously, a culvert entrance on a construction, how would you protect this inlet? What's the proper way to do that, most likely, or a good way to do it? Probably wouldn't use silt fence because it's concentrated flow. What's a good, thing that'll pond water? Gravel bags, right? So that's a suggestion here. A couple rows high, a couple rows deep. It's going to do a pretty good job of ponding the water upstream of that inlet before it goes in. It's good to, on this one, it's already, they need to clean it out, but throw a couple bags on the downstream side so when the water, if it wears over, it hits the bag, it's kind of a little energy dissipator. This is hard to see, but what's happening is the vegetation is growing up through the soil, through the erosion control blanket and lifting it off the ground. So what's the problem with that? It's called, what the manufacturers of that call it pillowing, when the blanket comes up off the ground. This is the result of improper stapling of the blanket. The manufacturers, most of them recommend 1 staple per every 3/4 of a square yard of material. And that's because blankets only work if they have intimate contact with the soil. Because what they do is they slow the water down. The water can't get any sort of velocity if it's running along with the blanket there. It creates too much friction, too much head loss. So crummy blanket installation, you get some vegetation growing after a first rain. The blanket gets lifted off the ground. What happens underneath the blanket? You get a bunch of rilling, correct? You guys have probably seen that. Everybody's scratching their head wondering why the site's not meeting standards. It becomes a very expensive endeavor then to pull the blankets off, regrade the slopes, and install them correctly. But that's what you need to require if you run across this type of problem on your site. You can't go out there now and just start pounding staples into it. You're going to need 1,000,000 staples to get it all down. You got to pull it off and redress the slope and put the blanket back. And it's not going to be a popular request, but it's one that's going to happen. So obviously, this is a difficult site. It's steep. And what's the major problem here that you see? You've got visqueen down on the undercut roadway. There's still a little tough to see, but what's going on right through here, correct? It's eroding underneath the plastic, exactly. So it's just not a BMP that's cutting it. This is a 6% street. It's a difficult thing to do. What we actually ended up doing here is putting down 2 inches of AC. And they were just going to break it up and use it as base after they came in. That was the solution. But obviously this isn't working. The superintendent said, they came out there and visqueened it and put all these bags down. And he said it looked like an ice skating rink while it was raining. The bags were just moving all over, you know, sliding down the visqueen, and they got a little water behind them. So, tough situation, but that may be what you have to go to on a steep street like this, is pavement. Here, kind of a similar problem, but, you know, pretty obvious that the gravel bags just aren't spaced close enough, correct? How do I know that? Well, because I see this gully and I see this gully. If you're out seeing substantial rilling and gullying in between the gravel bags, it means very easily that there needs to be another row of gravel bags in between. And there's still too much energy in that water, and you need to have another intermediate row to knock it down. What would give you pause if you just were out inspecting this site? What's the issue here? Anybody got an idea? Yeah, there's a straw wattle there, and that's maybe iffy. There certainly isn't, you know, good erosion control either. But it's not raining, it's a sunny day. I'm out there, and the thing that I'm going to be worried about is that there's water in that V-ditch, because it's leaving the site. And it's, in this case, you know, it's hard to know from a picture, but this is a roller compacted concrete job where they have to keep the aggregate piles that you see in the background there cool. That is a man-made non-stormwater that we can't allow to leave the site. So that's got to be picked up somehow, pumped back on the pile, used for dust control on the site, but I can't, as an inspector, I can't allow that water to be discharging off the site like that. Stockpile, it's just uncovered. Any stockpile that's not used for longer than 14 days has to be covered, and they have to be covered before rain events. So some of these get, you know, pretty tough. The next series here of slides, what can you do on locations like this where you have a lot of stuff opened up, you're in the middle of the grading operation, you have to go back to the basics. I need to put erosion control down. Well, if I'm going to be out working this site, I just need to go and use what my cheap spray-on erosion controls, correct? It's $400 an acre, but that's what I'm going to do. And then I have to have my basic sediment controls. Probably need a silt, a detention basin down at the downstream end of this. And I'm going to need some straw wattles on the slopes, my basic perimeter controls. Just because it's a big active construction site doesn't mean I can abdicate all responsibility. Same thing here, you know, building a big buttress key on a slope. They're out there working it, they're going to be out there working it as soon as it dries out after the rain event. What are my options? Well, putting down straw wattle on the slope probably isn't going to be productive, but I can certainly go out and hit the whole area with a binder. I can certainly make sure that I have a sediment basin and perimeter controls downstream of that location to be knocking some of the biggest problems out. What do you think about this? You know, I see this a lot. A straw wattle used as a check dam. Does this look like it was helpful in any way and, you know, furthered the cause for clean water? No. The water stacked up behind it, then it cut around and flanked it. What is, you know, something that you're supposed to use in a case like this? What is the approved, you know, methodology? Rock, right? A rock check dam. It's going to have some longevity. It's going to stay there. The water's going to bleed through it. You put a rock pad down below to keep the erosion from occurring. So don't allow silt fences and straw wattles to be used in concentrated flow areas. We had that chart. They are sheet flow devices. Use the right tool for the job. So a concentrated flow device here would be a rock check dam. And again, you would want to make sure you're dissipating the energy downstream of the dam by putting enough rock down below it as well. This has nothing to do with water quality, but I thought I'd give you a break. You know, guy was running along the freeway with this rig on the back of a flatbed, and just the boom of that went right through the overpass. Pretty interesting, huh? Of course, they do have to clean up all the broken concrete. I don't know how they fixed that bridge, though. They must have had to tear it down. This was a picture that I took out on the 91 freeway when we were looking at a site for Caltrans. And, you know, using K-rail as a retaining wall aside, what are some of the other problems that you can see here? There's a lot going on in this picture, right? Got a very steep slope back here, correct? I don't know, you guys probably have your own opinion about visqueen. My opinion of visqueen is low. You know, it seems to work for about the first 15 minutes of a storm, but when you get much wind or water flowing off it, it kind of gives up the ghost. You can see that this is already, you know, got a piece here that's exposed, so that would take a lot more care. They didn't include any down here. That's an issue. We seem to have a lot of potentially very fine concrete that was crushed down here. That could be, like we talked about before, a pH issue. These slopes, you know, they're unprotected. This looks like it's going to be a conveyance or a concentrated flow path. It's certainly the low points. You're going to have a lot of water flowing in there. So I'm concerned about that too. You know, there needs to be some riprap put in there. The slopes need to be protected. A lot of different options for the slopes. They'd have to be cleaned up a little to put blankets on them. They could be sprayed. But this is clearly, you know, unacceptable in terms of meeting the requirements of proper erosion and sediment control. This is a sediment basin, as you can tell, but what is the missing element from this sediment basin design? Well, this construction of a sediment basin. Exactly, a spillway. This is frightening, really, right? So if this riser fails, gets clogged or whatever, and the water keeps ponding up, it's going to pond up to here, and then this embankment is going to fail catastrophically. So when you see impounded water, make sure, all you have to do is ask the questions. Is it designed for fact sheet SE, per fact sheet SE2? Was it designed by a civil engineer? You're done. You know, well, then you should look and see if it has a spillway still. But basic elements to make sure it's a public safety issue and it's also a water quality issue in this case. The problem here, this is a silt fence. Concentrated flow. It's the wrong tool for the job. This is in the middle of the stream. It just pushed it over. It's not going to make it. Silt fence is not strong enough. Water weighs 62.4 pounds per cubic foot. It's a lot. It's going to be pushing against it laterally and it's going to knock it over. This one's a little hard to see. The biggest thing that gave me pause on this site is there's water running along through here and they just put down some visqueen. And the problem was down here, that non-stormwater was very cloudy and turbid. Back up here, it actually came out of a spring. It was very clear. So the problem was that they were introducing turbidity to this non-stormwater. It's fine in this case that it's discharging off-site because it's meeting our criteria, right? It's natural, it's by gravity. But we screwed it up with turbidity along the way, and that's unacceptable. So they needed to do a better job of keeping the earthwork from coming in contact with that. So this is my last slide here, and then we'll have Dan finish up real quickly. And we already saw this one, but I just wanted to point out on this that you can get to the goal line. This was a site that shut down in 2008 due to the economy. It was completely rough graded. All the pads were in, all the slopes were in, and then the developer walked away. Had terrible problems with it that subsequent rainy season. We were missing, it was getting, 1,000 turbidity units regularly. The board, was enforcing against the site. Came back in, and this site was going to sit for 5 years probably at least, because these were large estate lots, didn't see a market for them. In fact, it just now restarted construction, it's 2012, so 2008 it was 5 years that it sat. In order to keep it good for 5 years, we use the top of the line stuff. You can see these are not straw wattles, these are compost wattles. They go for about 3 times what a straw wattle does. The difference being, they're gonna be there in 5 years. You know, they're a plastic mesh that's filled with compost. They're very heavy, especially when they get wet. So you just lay them down behind a row of stakes and they press themselves into the ground. That slope was sprayed with bonded fiber matrix, $5,500 an acre. But I'll tell you what, this is a 140-acre site, cost $1.2 million to essentially do this to the whole site. Every rainy season after that, no problems. We were below 250 turbidity units. So the tools do exist to get you to the goal line, but it's not cheap. And you're going to be battling people because of that. It's going to be an expense. You know, well, in some cases, for the uninitiated, it's an unbudgeted expense, so it makes it all the harder. But we do have the tools, and you can, it's not something, you're not asking the impossible, I guess is my point. So anyway, thanks. We got, I think we better forego the break because we're so close to lunch, and we're just going to have Dan blast right through the last module here. It won't go a half hour.
Thanks, Scott. All right, so I'm going to go through some BMPs for small sites, specifically the single-family residential sites and the small urban commercial sites. That I'm sure you have a lot of these type of construction sites within your jurisdiction. So similar to the larger sites that Scott went through, there's a lot of the same type of controls and BMPs that have to be considered on the smaller construction sites. One of the biggest concerns is perimeter controls. For the smaller sites, that's absolutely critical because a lot of the other BMPs, there's just not enough space to be able to implement them on site. Tracking controls, building storage materials are all important as well. I'm just going to go through some of the major differences between the larger sites and the smaller sites. So first thing is building material storage. So because a lot of the smaller sites have space constraints, one of the good ways that materials can be stored, they can actually be stored within the construction themselves. You can see the picture on the left. They've incorporated the building materials and some of their debris and waste actually in the building itself. So that's definitely a good example of a control. If it can't be done and stored inside the building, a really good solution is just a shipping container. They can usually be fit into 2 parallel parking spaces, and the good thing is that they can also be locked up. Obviously, there's issues out there with building materials being stolen, so this can solve two issues with that one solution. If neither of those are a possibility, and you have to store things out on site, or the construction site has to store those things outside, then making sure that they're tarped and those tarps are tied down is critical. If at all possible, if you can incorporate storing materials within the perimeter controls, that's great. Obviously, that's not always feasible with the smaller sites, and if that's the case, then the shipping containers work the best. Equipment. We see a lot of the smaller construction sites have their equipment actually parked out on the street in front of the sites. So it's because they're actually in the conveyance system when they're parked out on the street, it's critical that they implement BMPs for that equipment. So putting the drip pans, even putting perimeter controls around those vehicles when they're not being used really help prevent pollutants from getting into the system. Trash is also an issue for the smaller sites. We get a lot of windbone trash, a lot of trash coming off the sites. And so having an adequate number of trash receptacles on the site and making sure that if there is a dumpster, usually those are parked out on the street for the smaller sites, making sure that they have covers on them when they're not in use. The last one here is the porta potties. We see almost all of the smaller construction sites have porta potties. It's even a requirement in some of the grading ordinances and construction ordinances that the sites have porta potties on site, but they're not always placed in the best location. If they can be placed within the perimeter controls, that's great, but absolutely, whether they're in or outside of the perimeter controls, they have to have that secondary containment, the drip pans that go underneath them. Concrete trunks and pumpers. So we see a lot of these type of activities with the smaller construction sites, and they're usually working from the street and providing either pumping, or they're just, the mixers are out on the street and they're bringing in the cement or the concrete into the construction site itself. So because they're working on the street, there's some specific BMPs that they need to employ. One, they should establish perimeter controls around those vehicles when activities are going on. They should use tarps under the vehicles so that if there's any spillage that goes on, it's a lot easier to clean those things up. We already talked about the fact that if you get concrete, in the conveyance system, that increases the pH of your receiving water. So critical that these get implemented. And then there's always residue that goes on with these activities that, with the pumpers and the mixers that go on in the street. That needs to be cleaned up immediately. So this is an example of an individual lot erosion control plan. So you can see there's perimeter controls, there's even off-site flows that are coming onto the site that is being diverted around the construction activities on the site. You see stockpiles that are being covered. You have adequate track out. Even the smaller sites should have a erosion control plan. It's in some of the ordinances. And they should have a very simple map that's easy to read, that the contractors know what BMP should be implemented on site. Some really good guidance has been developed by the City of San Clemente. They have this developed specifically for those smaller construction sites, and they go through all of the different BMPs, everything from equipment, washout areas, the concrete trucks and pumpers that we talked about, perimeter controls. So this is a really good resource, and I recommend the development of these type of flyers for each jurisdiction. So I'm going to go through the same type of exercise that Scott went through. I'm going to focus on some of the smaller sites, and again, I would like you to kind of identify if you see good things or bad things associated with some of these sites. So site number 1. What do you all see as an issue on this particular site? And go ahead and just say it. You don't have to wait. Anybody? Perimeter controls, right? There's a lot of track out right in the front there. That's a ribbon gutter. So they're right in the conveyance system there. There are a couple good things about this site. Anybody can tell me that? What's that? Storage inside, exactly. You've got your porta potty inside. There is a drip pan in this porta potty, and then you've actually got your pile inside as well. I'd like to see it with some visqueen over it, but at least they have it on the inside of the garage. All right, what's wrong with this site? They got the porta potty right on the beach here. And, really good infiltrating soils, but you shouldn't be using the beach as your BMP. So there's actually no drip pan underneath this. So the recommended action would be what? Move it. Move it off-site and get a drip pan. Or move it to another part of the construction site. Issues here? What's that? Perimeter controls, right? If you can see further back, you don't see any perimeter controls. What's the problem with the truck here? It's kind of hard to see. There's some track out there, and the truck's obviously been leaking some oil, and it's leaking it right in the gutter there. So that needs to be cleaned up. A little harder to see, but there's an issue in both the background and the foreground of this picture. What's in the foreground there? Concrete waste, right. So there's concrete and cement waste right there, can easily get right into the gutter. In the background, it looks like they're trying to protect the tree there, which is a good thing, protecting vegetation. But the problem is, and it's kind of hard to see, but there is some sandbags that have split their guts right there. The silt fence is falling down, is really becoming just debris. And there's actually an oil can right there as well. So there's some debris that needs to be picked up, and they need to reestablish the silt fence. What's going on here? Dust control, perimeter controls, track out. There's a lot of issues at this site. We were actually out there taking pictures, and they started fixing things up knowing that they had an issue out there. So yeah, definitely an issue here. Pretty straightforward. What do you guys see here? Track out, perimeter controls, same kind of things. What about here? Inlet protection. There's no inlet protection, and if you can kind of see that through that fence, there's a stockpile right on the other side. So first rain event, that sediment's going right into the drain inlet. Okay, this is a trick one. What do you guys see as an issue here? Looks pretty good, doesn't it? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the plastic K-rails. What's that? So on the other side of the K-rails, there's no perimeter controls or anything. So they're trying to use the K-rails as a perimeter control, but the problem is, if you look at the bottom of the K-rails, there's those holes for picking them up for with the forklifts. All that sediment's just going to go right out there. So what's the fix here then? Sandbags. They can keep the K-rails, but you got to put sandbags on the other side. Kind of hard to see here, but we've got significant track out issues. And it looks like in the foreground there's some spilt oil, and obviously the perimeter controls. All right, what about this one? Stockpile? That's right. The stockpile's right in the gutter itself. So it's in the conveyance system. What else? Perimeter controls? No perimeter controls. As you can see, this is a common theme with a lot of the smaller sites. No perimeter controls. What about here? Looks all right, but there's no cover on it. This is after construction. The construction crew has left for the day, so it's not covered. There's debris somewhat around that as well. What about this one? Stockpile in the back? Yep.
I have a question on the one you passed.
Yep.
I don't require them to put the cover on the 10-yard bins if there isn't a threat of rain, if it's not heaping over and tile. Is there actually something that says every single night something like that has to be covered?
Yep. Requirement in the CGP, so they need to be covered. Because it's wind erosion is, you know, you can blow trash out of it, and then there could be a rain event that happens, and then water's getting into the system, and then it's leaking. So
But that's, the construction general permit, like the man that was over here earlier said, that's not a requirement of the people in the counties to enforce that. But something like that.
but if you see something like this, you should identify it to them as well. Yep.
I just, I don't know that site is or isn't a construction general permit, but,
It-
most often they have the requirement that 48 hours predicted measurable rain. So I make sure they have a chart and it has to be able to be down, but if it's not full, I wouldn't have said they have to put that.
My suggestion is that they cover it every night. Yeah. And this site is not subject to the CGP, but it's good practice to have these things covered every night. So stockpile, someone noticed that. There's also some aggregate and sediment within the gutter right here. They are obviously doing some cut and replace there, and that needs to be cleaned up. Okay, there's good things and bad things about this one. What's a good thing? What's that? There's curb. There's still potential for that sediment to discharge out. So this is kind of your call. I'd like to see a silt fence on the street side of that area. But what about the porta potty? Everything good there? There's a drip pan there, so that's a good thing. It's kind of hard to see. And this is after the construction site, the construction workers have gone for the day, and you've got an open construction bin. So.
Porta potty is sitting in the paved area, if they tip over, you could find the nearest catch basin.
Yeah, the other thing is that the porta potty is, I mean, it's good that they have secondary containment, but it's an area where, you know, some teenagers at night could just tip it over, right? So maybe within the construction area itself and something fenced in would be better. What about this one? No perimeter controls, right? We got some track out in the street. So what do you do about something like this? This is a tough one, right? Real small little area that they're constructing. But you notice that there's cars still in the parking lot. So that means public's probably walking through these areas, walking in and out. I would cordon this area off, put some perimeter controls around it, make sure that the public can't get access to this particular area. You might lose a parking space or two, but that needs to be done. Right. Yeah, there's this, that's right. It's not a safety issue here. Okay, there's 4 or 5 things going on with this picture. Can you guys pick them out? This fence is the perimeter, by the way. Stockpile, trash. It's an inlet right there, right? So that's an issue. That's not done correctly. What about those bags in the back there? Cement. As soon as it gets wet, guess what? There's also, can't really see it very well on this screen, but there's some cement just out in the dust area there. And there's no perimeter controls. This is in Laguna Beach, right next to the ocean. So this stuff's going off site and going right down to the ocean. What's the problem here? I've got a couple more minutes. I've got 2 more slides. So problem here is no perimeter controls. You've got debris on the site, and it's wide open. So stockpile, no perimeter controls. This is one of my favorites. What do you guys see here? Stockpile, no perimeter controls. You've got track out here right in the curb and gutter. Looks like there's some paint cans outside in the back. The good thing is they do have some stuff in the garage. Okay, last slide. So, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of issues going on here, but there is looks like some track out and some dust. But the point of this slide is, look at the sign. It says open during construction. There are some sites where it's just not appropriate for a parking lot to be open. More cars come in, more cars tracking things out. So, best case scenario here, cordon off your construction area so the public doesn't have access to it, and that way you're not getting as much traffic.
Question, for a small site like that, is it too much to ask for erosion control? Because we talked about the perimeter control.
It's getting into your MS4. It's not too much to ask. They need to do it. It's part of your ordinances. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you all for your time today.